So, thank you so much for coming to the McGill and CIRRELT Transportation Seminar. Introducing Jarrett Walker is very hard. So I'm not sure if I should be talking about the many transit networks he has redesigned around the world, from Dublin to Austin, to many in Australia, to many in North America, to China, to Portland, Oregon. But I think I prefer to introduce him as, I think, something that's near to his heart, by introducing him as the author of Human Transit. I hope this is a book I received as a gift one day from a student who told me, you should read this. This is very good. That was like 7 years ago. And actually, it is very good. And when his new edition came out, I felt like, oh, that's excellent. That's not very good. That's way beyond very good. So I wanted Jarrett to start to be the one who picks out this seminar series, but he told me, I'm coming to Montreal. Why don't I speak in person? So he was really generous that he said, okay, he'll come and speak to you guys in class, in person. So it's a pleasure and honor to have you, Jarrett, here in person to teach that seminar. We have a big crowd online as well. So this is hybrid, and we're recording, and we have the big crowd in the classroom. Well, thank you so much for your coming. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Ahmed, and thanks very much, everyone. I am, well, I'm going to talk just a little bit about sort of where I'm coming from and share some of the key ideas from the book, and hopefully we'll get some good discussion going. I just need to remember how.
Jarrett, your camera is closed.
My what?
You have to open the camera.
All right.
Sorry for technical difficulties.
All righty. What do I need to do now? I need to.
We have to open the camera. So you're sharing, that's fine. You have to go to the.
That got turned off for some reason.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
That should be on. All right.
So now they can see you plus the screen.
Now is everything working?
I think so.
Okay, good. There we are. All right. Okay. So who am I? I have been for about 30 years a consultant who is hired mostly by public transit agencies or local governments to help think about the design of public transit networks, mostly the layout of bus routes and schedules. Sometimes we also get into rail structures. And we all get drawn then into transit service policy, analysis, advice, and that in turn gets us drawn in inevitably into goals clarification and storytelling, because one of the primary things that's wrong with public transit, in my experience, is lack of clarity about goals. And a somewhat confused conversation about what the ultimate goal really is. You'll hear, for example, many journalists will approach this topic assuming that ridership is the primary measure of the success of transit. And journalists will call me and say, oh, ridership's going down, what's wrong? Or ridership's going up, what are you doing right? And I'm always having to say, well, actually, transit has a whole bunch of different goals, and some of them are not measured by ridership at all. Some of them are measured by other things. So a lot of what we do in our projects generally is encourage a clearer conversation about goals, and so that we know that we're measuring things that actually matter to us. I won't spend much time on my experience. Ahmed's study summarized it briefly, but this is something we've been doing in a lot of places. I first wrote the first edition of this book in 2010. It came out in 2011. And the thing I was most trying to do was to establish the discipline of distinguishing between goals and expertise. Goals or values on the one hand and expertise on the other. So if you've ever heard a traffic engineer say, the data say that we need to widen the road, that is an example of a methodological failure of failing to recognize the difference between goals and expertise. Okay. No, the data never will tell you to do anything. The data in combination with a clearly stated goal may then give you guidance about what to do. And it's important to always be clear about that. So one of the basic things I say at the start of the book is that My job is to not make you share my values, but to give you the tools to clarify and advocate yours. I work with lots of different kinds of communities where people have lots of different goals for transit. And I'm unusually disciplined about making sure that I'm asking them the questions, sometimes difficult questions, that lead us to a plan that meets their goals, even if they're not mine. So I wrote the book originally because I wanted there to be, because we have this problem in North America that local elected officials are constantly cycling into positions of authority in transit agencies without any real understanding of the topic. But also, talking to them are advocates, developers, all kinds of stakeholders and communities, and beyond that, voters who are all bringing various kinds of understandings or misunderstandings to the topic. Most of my work in North America has been south of the border, where this problem is generally worse. The problem is somewhat less in Canada in my experience, but it certainly exists here too. The problem generally being that most of our decision makers are themselves motorists, have perhaps used public transit when they were on vacation in Europe, or used public transit when they were in college in a nice transit-rich environment like this one, but now they live, out in the suburbs somewhere, and they drive everywhere, and they don't necessarily have the right set of assumptions. And often what they'll do is start with the assumption that transit works the way cars work in some way, or that or bring in appropriate metaphors to thinking about public transit. So I wanted to give them all a book that they could just read to sort of think through the fundamental geometric questions that transit presents us with. But the other interesting thing about it is you look at transit geometrically, you find that it asks you certain particular hard questions about your values. So for example, one of the things I'm known for is I wrote the first paper back in 2008 on what I call the ridership coverage trade-off. The fact that if you were to design transit networks purely for a goal of ridership, you wouldn't go everywhere, because there are places where the land use patterns are just so unsuited to transit. And so that means if we are going to those places anyway, we're going there for a reason other than ridership. And so we need to have a conversation clearly about that, so that, because if we don't do that, what happens is that all those services just get counted as failure, right? All those services that we run into low density suburban areas where we carry 3 people who really appreciate us, all gets counted as failure with respect to our goal of ridership. This is a very lively conversation in your province right now. You have a provincial government that is actively trying to, demanding that transit agencies achieve a higher level of efficiency with less resources. Well, we got to talk back to them. What are you counting as efficiency? You're talking about revenue? You're talking, okay, the way to maximize fare revenue and maximize ridership is to stop serving a whole bunch of the region. But is that really what you want to do? Then if not, then let's be clear that we are going there for some other reason that is not ridership, but that also counts, and that needs to count in our accounting. And then finally, there's quite a bit of discussion about land use and location choice. So the first book came out in 2011. By 2023, it was clear that we had a problem that, I guess this is going to keep coming up here, isn't it? I'm going to keep turning this off over and over. It's frustrating. We had a problem that so much had happened since 2011 that a book, copyright 2011, was just going to be assumed to be out of date, even if it wasn't. The book is mostly not out of date. The 2011 version is still perfectly useful, but unfortunately, that keeps coming up.
I'm admitting them, so don't ignore it.
Okay, it just, I can't make it, I'm sorry, I can't get this off the screen. It keeps reappearing. Hiding. But the, so I needed essentially to update the book to respond to some of the things that had happened more recently. One of the things that had happened more recently was the pandemic, but really the more impactful thing is that we had an enormous amount of venture capital spent on the goal of confusing influential people about how public transit works. And this money was being spent by companies promoting driverless cars, companies promoting electric cars, companies promoting various kinds of supposed alternatives to public transit that were that constituted some sort of imagined reinvention. So I had to push back on all that and lay out clearly why conventional public transit, the big fixed vehicle running a fixed route, still has an absolutely foundational role in cities and will in all imaginable futures. And that was and because so much money is being spent sowing confusion about that. I also added a new chapter on planning for diversity, which is really focused on challenging the notion of elite projection. Elite projection is the tendency of fortunate people to think about themselves as the typical customer. So, you know, I was at a reception once long ago where a bunch of influential people were there, and I was talking about the importance of buses as a layer in the transit network. And a woman who was the chair of the architecture department at a major university said, "But I would never ride a bus." And that was the moment when I coined that term, because I realized what I had to say was, congratulations, you're in an extremely elite position in your society. That means there aren't very many people like you. That means it would be foolish of us to design a mass transit system around your personal tastes. And that's the thing we have to be consciously and lovingly warning our elites about, because many of them deep down really would like to believe that they're regular people and everyone else makes decisions the way they do, but they're not. And so that's elite projection. It's something I talk about in the book. And also challenging the choice rider fallacy, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's an expanded discussion of location choice, but most importantly, there's this new focus on freedom. Now, by freedom, I mean what transport scholars like Professor Elganady usually describe as access or accessibility. And an enormous amount of important work is being done on this right now. And it's really one of the, I think, the most exciting way to talk about public transit. And although lots of scholars are doing a lot of work on this tool and on how to make this tool more useful, I think my contribution maybe is mostly just a rhetorical move, the metaphor of the wall around your life. So I want people to think about where they can go as representing a kind of boundary that constrains their lives, so that you can imagine the possibility of moving that boundary outward. So here's a person. She's in a city full of possible destinations, places she could shop, places she could work, places she could study, people she could meet, things she could do. And in an amount of time she's likely to have in her day, there's an area she could get to on the transit system as it is. So her access to opportunity is just the amount of all that good stuff that is in that area. Now, obviously, right away, you can think about some ways to complicate this. The notion of a fixed travel time budget, that sounds a little bit arbitrary. You may be familiar with the idea of Marchetti's constant, the notion that over many periods of history, people have tolerated a commute time of about 30 minutes each way. But the point is, but what I'm appealing to really is everybody's experience of having not done something because it would take too long to get there. Having not taken a job because it would take too long to get there. Having denied yourself some opportunity because you simply did not have access to it in an amount of time that was going to fit into your life. And so as long as you've had that experience, then that's what I'm describing. And we can use arbitrary cutoffs for the travel times. And of course, I use different ones for different kinds of trips, but the basic idea is the same. Now, the travel time calculation, it's very important, is a sum of these three parts of every trip: the walk, the wait, and the ride. And there are some subtleties to each of these, but the important thing is that a total transit trip begins when you want to leave home, or you can calculate it backward from when you want to get to your destination. And so it includes the walking time, the waiting time, and the riding time. The waiting time, there are several views on, and we have a particular view on it, and some people disagree with us about it. But my view about waiting time is that we should consider part of your travel time half of the headway of each service that you board. In other words, if you're going to get on a bus that comes every hour, it's as though you waited 30 minutes. Now, in fact, you know, you may sit in a cafe until the bus comes, you have your app, but still, you're not where you want to be. I often have, especially relatively wired people, push back on me at this point and say, but really, I'm sitting in a cafe, I'm working, it doesn't matter if the bus is once an hour. There were people actually arguing when the apps first came out. was like, oh, great, we can run buses less frequently now because people will just sit in the cafe and wait for them. And no, because the barista in that cafe clocked in at 8 o'clock. That's when their job started, right? And if the hourly bus gets there at 7:02 or 8:02, they're going to wait 58 minutes at their destination before their shift starts. In other words, the assumption that everybody has the leisure to make use of all of their time is also a somewhat elitist assumption, which is not something that we should be projecting onto the entire population. Many, many people have jobs that can only be done where they are. And I am very committed to thinking about those people as the default person, rather than thinking about someone like myself who can sit in a cafe and work. Because that's the situation most people are in. So it's the sum of those things that we're calculating. So what does that look like in a study? Oh, we did this redesign in Dublin, Ireland, and imagine someone in a particular location in Dublin. She's asking where could she be in 45 minutes. This was a redesign in which we took an existing network that was overwhelmingly radial, almost all going into the city, and revised it to be much more of a grid pattern with orbital services, frequent orbital services intersecting frequent radial services. And so the answer to her question is a blob, of course, and then under the proposed question network, it's a different blob, and I can calculate exactly what's in that area that she's gained. She's lost a tiny bit of area, she's gained a lot of area, but more importantly, on net, she's gained access to about 25% more jobs. And you could do the same calculation with other kinds of opportunities. But here is where I, not being an academic, can wave my arms in a big generalized way and say, see, it's like she's 25% more free. Because what is freedom but the presence of meaningful alternatives before you about different things you could do, right? Meaningful choices of different things you could do. And that's what we're measuring. So then we aggregate that, so that was the result for that location, Dundrum. So we color that zone accordingly, and we get a citywide picture of improvement of access. And that gets me averaged across the population to the soundbite. The average Dubliner can get to 16% more destinations in 45 minutes. This becomes a very hard thing to be against. And that's important because bus network redesigns, if you've ever been around one, they're extremely controversial. Because it feels very entitled to their bus doing what it always did, and get very angry when you're changing it. And that's just part of the default background noise of doing this work. And so I always need the soundbite that will cut through, so that Mrs. Murphy, who's angry that we're making her change buses, is against this, right? She's against this kind of comprehensive improvement in the usefulness of transit for the whole society. And this, of course, is in the context, by the way, of Irish government policy, which is extremely focused and extremely clear about the fact that climate is an urgent issue, social inclusion is an urgent issue, equity is an urgent issue. These things all intersect in urban form, require denser urban development that depends less on cars, therefore requires a robust transit program. Working in Ireland's been especially interesting because the policy clarity about that is extremely strong and has sustained even as governments have flipped back and forth. So now the cool thing about access is that I can use the same metric to tell different stories to people who care about different things. So an economist would say that the whole reason we're all here in a city is to have access to the opportunities presented by each other's presence. That's what a city is for. And that we can measure the effectiveness of a city then fundamentally in travel time, in the extent to which people are actually able to access things, actually able to get together and do the things that happen when people get together, jobs, studying, social life, everything else. Well, that's what we're measuring, isn't it? We're measuring the fundamental functionality of the city at the thing a city is for. If I'm talking to an economist or I say that, or someone interested fundamentally in prosperity. If you're interested in ridership, well, the access analysis is really capturing the way network design affects ridership. It's not a ridership prediction because other stuff happens too. Lots of externalities affect ridership, but it does isolate what the design of the network does. And we're finding, and Professor Elganadius has done work on this, and several other scholars have as well, that we're seeing a pretty good correlation between access and ridership as we look at the ridership that comes out of a particular area compared to the access that the network provides to that area. And then finally, as I've said, it's simply personal freedom. That's why I call it the wall around your life. I want people to feel that sense of their lives constrained by not being able to get to certain things they'd like to get to, and to imagine what it would be like to be better. Another cool thing about this tool is that although I'm a transport planner and I use it in a transport planning context, you can and should be using it for land use planning, because there are two ways to improve your access. One is to move your wall further out, and that's transport, and the other is to put more cool stuff inside the wall you can already get to, which is land use planning. So, but again, cool thing, access is a geometric fact. Think about what we're doing. So much of the transport planning methodologies that are out there are based fundamentally on either trying to figure out what people want to do or just observing what people are doing now. And both of those become fundamentally human sciences, social sciences, studies of humans and human behavior and human desires and so on. But we're doing something simpler. We're just studying what people could do. So rather than thinking about people out there as someone we need to understand and study and get in the heads of, we're taking a much more passive view of them, which in my view is much more liberating, which is simply to say, we just want them to be free to do whatever they want. We don't need to know who they are. I need to know a lot less about them if all I want to do is liberate them. And that's fundamentally what it's about. Think about what's going on when you pick up a report and it says that year 2045 travel demand across this bridge will be this. Or in 2045, we'll have this many people doing this. That prediction of human behavior 20 years in the future, a generation. What are they doing? They're saying fundamentally that we are sure that when you are the same age that your parents are now, you will behave exactly like they do. We are expressing a certainty that everyone is a copy of their parents, because that's what we're doing. We're taking people's behavior today, which is your parents' behavior, going out 20 years, 25 years, and saying that'll be your behavior at the same age. You shouldn't believe that. I don't believe that. I want people to surprise. I want the future generations to surprise us. I don't want them to do what I predict they will do. I don't want them to do what my generation did. And so I like, just sort of philosophically, being in this different position of not going to the prediction, but simply stopping at the possibility. But the other important fact, of course, is that we're just a whole lot more sure about geometric calculations than we are about anything in the social sciences. And so we just have a much higher level of certainty about the access calculation. And that's why, although the access calculation is inside ridership prediction methodologies, I'm just wanting to rip apart the black box and say, stop there, just show me this. Don't go to that next thing. So when I hear debates going on, and still too often, there'll be a debate about a proposed rail line, and everyone will be saying, but this thing only has 10,000 riders, as though that's a fact about the present that we know. No, that's a prediction about a bunch, that's somebody's prediction of human behavior. I'd rather talk about what kind of access this line is going to provide to how many people and whether that's worth it. Talk in terms of possibility rather than prediction. If you're interested in this whole topic and in the whole philosophical question of whether we could in fact do planning without predicting as much, I refer you to my paper, To Predict with Confidence, Plan for Freedom. You can find it free online. It's in the Journal of Public Transportation, 2018. Some uses of access analysis. Let me just show you a couple of applications of this concept. In Portland, Oregon, where I live, we had a project to make the case for a system of bus lanes. And the problem always when you're trying to make an argument for bus lanes is that, or for any sorts of improvement like this, is that you come out with figures like this project. If we do all these things and take all these parking spaces and make all these people mad, we'll save 4 minutes. And it sounds like very much. And so we figured, okay, let's describe it differently. let's say, okay, from the perspective of a particular place, this is a relatively low income spot in the city. There's also a community college there. How much do the bus lanes transform? How many jobs are reachable in 45 minutes? If you live there, or if you were going to school there, what area you could get to from there. That produced a large number. 56% more jobs accessible to someone living there in 45 minutes. If we have that extra 4 minutes of time, right? It just turns the number around and makes it important and makes it hard to be against. It's very hard to be the elected official who then says, I don't want you to have this access to that destination. It puts them in that situation. We've also found this a useful tool for talking about racial equity, which is a huge issue, especially south of the border, where we have a lot of very strict federal requirements about racial equity. This is a little study we did in Chicago, where we looked at the whole city. This was for the Chicago Transit Authority. We looked at the whole city, and we were looking at at the access to opportunity that different kinds of people, different segments of the society experience. And the first thing we found that was very interesting was that people all over Chicago have about the same access to area. They can all get to about 30 square miles, or they can all go about 4 linear miles from where they are in 45 minutes on the transit system. The issue isn't the area, but nevertheless, there's a huge difference by race in how many jobs are in that area. And this was a way of calling attention to the fact that the problem isn't the transit system, the problem is the racial development pattern, the racial land use pattern. If you know Chicago, you know that it has an extremely dense center, a relatively prosperous north side, and then a vast, vast south side that is overwhelmingly Black and that is just further from everything. What we did here was to just color things in according to how many jobs are within 2 miles of each point. You know, what is the overall size of the transportation problem? How much stuff is nearby, right? And calling out the fact that the parts of the city that are overwhelmingly minority, and especially the southern part that's overwhelmingly Black, is just further from everything. What does that mean? It means that, so, you know, a Black person in the south side of Chicago can get to the same amount of area, but there's just less stuff in that area. And so that's why they end up with a lower access to opportunity. So it's talking about the real thing that matters to people. It's calling out a racial inequity, but it's also making clear that the racial inequity is not the transit agency's fault, it's the land use system's fault. And it produces this problem for the agency, which is helpful right now in the conversation we're having. As in many places, they're operating in an environment where historically their funding has supposedly been tied to ridership and particularly to their fare box recovery, the portion of their costs that are paid for by fares. What we're observing is that if you plan to that standard, you will continue to increase the racial inequity of the service, because that will tell you to keep putting more and more service in the areas where Black and Latino people tend not to be. Not because you're discriminating against them, but simply because these people who are out here need more transportation to get the same amount of access because they are further away. Therefore, you would need to give them more and more service per capita to get the same number of trips out of them, which is a bad investment if you're purely thinking in ridership terms. In other words, there's a ridership equity trade-off. And if you're going to impose a ridership standard, this is where I'm really going. If you're going to impose a ridership standard and a demand planning be done to a ridership standard, you need to own that that is an anti-equity position because of the math of how this works. Math that ultimately boils down to the city's geography. So I thought that was another example, a simple example, interesting example of bringing this back to a big policy issue. So I want to make sure, I doubt very much that any of you still believes in these terms, but just in case any of you have heard these terms, I want to make sure that I've done what I can to give you the tools to push back on them. For much of my career, and you'll still hear this in many places, you'll hear the idea that the transit ridership can be divided into two kinds of people, a so-called choice rider, who is someone that we imagine has a car and chooses not to use the car, and a so-called dependent rider. We're supposed to visualize someone who doesn't have a car and who therefore has to use the system. This is a term, I still hear this terminology sometimes. I challenge it every time I hear it, and I encourage you to challenge it every time you hear it, because it's been one of the most misleading ways to think about public transit. And it actually goes back to very primitive models from decades ago when computing power was so weak that they had to make radically simplifying assumptions, and this was one of the assumptions they made. But because these terms are in the literature so much, you'll see it a lot in older literature especially, they've seeped out into the discourse, and you'll hear people using them. And usually when these terms get used in the discourse, the implication of the term choice rider is someone has a car in the driveway, he likes his car, and I have to convince him to leave his car behind by giving him something really wonderful. And on the other hand, even worse, the image of the dependent or captive rider is that they're stuck with us and have to use transit, no matter how bad it is. It's all completely wrong. What's wrong with this is that everyone's in the middle. And those really define the extremes of a spectrum, and very few people are at the extremes of the spectrum. Most of us, most of you, I imagine, are in intermediate situations where maybe you have a car, but you have lots of good reasons not to use the car, or maybe you don't have a car, but you can afford to take a taxi once in a while if transit really isn't there for you, or whatever. We are all in slightly different positions in different situations with slightly different motives. There's also the fact that car ownership, of course, is affected by other things, but one of the main things that happened in the late teens in the United States was that car ownership got cheaper in ways that caused people that the transit agency thought of as captive to disappear from the system because they bought cars, right? So the whole notion of dividing people up that way and focusing on the extremes has led to a lot of very bad planning. It's led in particular to the notion that we have to create something, sort of really special, expensive, snazzy thing in order to attract the choice rider. And whereas correspondingly, we don't need to invest very much in the services that dependent riders use because they're stuck with us, like what'll they do? Please just erase those terms from your mind, and don't take seriously any argument that you hear that relies on that binary. Because what's really important now is that high ridership is diverse ridership. It's diverse not just in race, age, and gender, but it's diverse in trip purpose. What's going on if you ride the subway here is that you're on the car with a lot of other people who are very different from each other and who are making all kinds of different trips for different purposes at different stages of their lives. And the genius of a big urban transit system is that all those people find the same service useful at the same time. And getting too obsessed with demographically analyzing your ridership can take you in exactly the wrong direction. It can take you in the direction of specializing, whereas the best transit services, the most successful transit services, are not specialized. Finally, just a couple of words about location choice. Okay. The stuff on location choice in the new edition of the book is basically the same as in the old edition, but I'm angrier about it now because I have another 12 years of experience banging my head against it. So here's what I say about it. Location choice creates the whole problem that we expect transport systems, including public transit, to solve. As people berate transit authorities for failing to solve the problem, they should remember who chose to make that problem easier or harder by choosing where some important destination would be and how it would be laid out. We have a particular heuristic for explaining the key geometric features of a development pattern and how they affect the viability of transit. You may have heard of a different set of factors that Robert Severo is known for publishing about 20 years ago. His terms all start with D. We came up with these terms instead. They're different in a couple of respects, one of which is that we use terms whose definitions are much more specific. And I want to be clear that I'm just talking about geometry here. I'm not talking about aesthetics. So for example, one of Robert Severo's terms is design. I find that term much too vague. It sounds like an aesthetic judgment, and I'm really just talking about geometry. This is really important because this is the point where I am in the position often in a conversation of having to say something that sounds like your neighborhood is bad. Their neighborhood is better. That is not something I want to have to say. So I have to say very clearly, you're all beautiful, but there are these geometric differences in how your neighborhood is laid out, and those differences matter. And let's try to explain it just geometrically so that it doesn't sound like I'm talking about your culture, because I'm not. I'm just talking about the geometry. So density, obviously, those two routes have the same cost to operate. They both have 2 buses on them, but the one on the top has twice as many people around every stop. So of course, all other things being equal, there are going to be more people who find that service useful. The ridership is going to be higher. Walkability, those 2 circles on the left represent a bus stop at the center and a 400-meter radius around the stop. The streets colored in are the places in that circle from which you can actually walk to the stop in 400 meters. So obviously a nicely connected street grid like we have around us here is optimal for getting as much of the circle within walking distance as possible. Barriers, cul-de-sacs, things like that are make it exactly as though the density were lower. They simply make the market of the stop smaller, justify less service. And of course, it must be safe to cross the street at every stop. If you get out into Laval and Longueuil, you'll encounter places where that's not necessarily true. You'll see a bus stop on opposite sides of the street as a place where it's not safe to cross the street. That's essentially one-way service, right? Because we're going to take you from this side of the street and bring you back to that side. Compactness, obviously, all other things being equal, will do better if we don't have to cross big gaps. But the most important of these is linearity. And linearity is particularly important because it's the thing that I have to pound the table about as a transit planner. My colleagues in land use and development planning all understand, or think they understand, density, walkability, and compactness. And those are standard terms that you'll see justified for all kinds of reasons in good development planning. But linearity is something that public transit in particular needs. And that is, we really benefit from things being laid out in reasonably straight lines so that a single line can be a reasonably direct path between any 2 of these points. So here are 2 ways that the same town could be laid out. If everything is in a line, I just need one line. And that line will serve all of those places, connect all of them to each other. And because it's the shortest possible line, it will be the most frequent possible line, because of course, the shorter distance means I can run more service at the same cost. But if it's built like the image down below, the office towers on the cul-de-sac by the freeway, the Canadian Tire or whatever behind a quarter-mile parking, the college or university up on the hilltop at the end of a long hilltop road, like Simon Fraser in Vancouver, for example, or whatever. We have a lose-lose situation where I have to either have multiple lines, which will cost more, or I have to deviate to each of these places, producing a circuitous line, which produces a longer travel time. The line is also longer in distance, which means I can't afford as much frequency. Everything is worse for transit when you build it that way. Campuses in general, in the late 20th century, I think many of the most sort of frustrating situations I encountered are especially the community colleges, which are oriented toward lower income people seeking to develop technical skills that tend to get built in this classic campus way, where the buildings are intentionally as far apart from the arterial behind as much green space and parking as possible, with the arterials way out here. When I'm running transit, though, I want to go straight down the arterial and I want people to be able to walk to the destinations. It's exactly the opposite of this. You know, they'll give me a bus stop here if I want to drive the bus in there, but I don't want to drive the bus in there because I don't want to take everyone else out of their way. I want to not have to make that trade-off, right? Don't build it that way. Dense housing. This is an example that I encountered in the suburbs of Atlanta, where we have dense housing. You'll see this a lot, built on a collector street that ends in 2 T intersections. How am I supposed to draw a bus route through this? I want to keep going in a relatively straight line, but a network with lots of T intersections requires me to constantly be turning. And, you know, what do I do at a T intersection? I have a route there, but then I also need a route here. And then, so that route's going to come up there and it's going to deviate one of those as it turns either right or left. It's just an inefficient structure. And then in addition, you have phenomena like the big high-speed boulevard where the important collector comes in with a right in, right out intersection, which means that I can't run two-way service through it because I can't make the same movement in both directions. Don't build it like that. And I'm particularly aggravated by social services. And again, let's stipulate this as an example from south of the border. I'm sure you would never do this in Canada. But this is this is a study I did for one of the poorest major cities in California, Salinas, California. Average household income is about $25,000. It's really a overwhelmingly Spanish-speaking community, really oriented around the surrounding agricultural markets. And so in this very low-income community where lots of people can't afford cars, where are the government offices that people will have to go to access various services? So there's the Social Security Administration, there's the County Government Center on a cul-de-sac by the freeway, there's the Employment Services Department, and there's the Department of Child Support. And they're all on this squiggly hourly bus route. And these people can say, why do these important social services only have a squiggly hourly bus route? And the answer is because you built them out there. Right? Because you located them out there. You could have located them downtown next to the transit center and we wouldn't have a problem. But each of these various government agencies saw fit to locate itself near the freeway. In this case, out near a private airport that doesn't generate any other demand. And so we end up having to have this hourly bus route to get out to these places where these essential social services have been marooned. Nothing's happening in these offices that requires all that land. You're just going up to a counter and talking to someone. There's no reason that couldn't happen downtown, but this is how things get built. And this is a lot of what we end up with. So I want to leave you with the notion, wherever you are in your career and whatever kind of planning you're working on, and however constrained you feel by the conversation going on around you, never forget to ask, why is this thing here? Who decided to put it there? And how do we hold them responsible for the consequences of that decision? So thanks. Look forward to your comments about that.
Okay, we have time for questions and we have questions online, so we can start by some here and then I'll stop and ask some of the questions from online.
Questions, sir.
Well, now, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
But thank you very much for a superb presentation. Let me just say that you're doing a great service by stressing the importance of asking the right questions to clarify one's own thinking, and also stressing the importance of thinking hard about objectives and goals rather than just thinking about obvious alternatives. And lastly, pointing out the flaws in conventional transport planning, which just takes the present, projects it into the future, then provides for it, and then say, oh my God, things are happening just as we predicted. Which reminds me of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's, The Little Prince. He said, as to the future, it's one of my favorite quotes, as to the future, our task is not to predict, but to enable it. There you go. Thank you.
Not to predict, but to enable.
Questions?
Where can we find your book?
All the usual places. I think if you Google it, you will find it. I also encourage you to, if you have physical bookstores in your life, I encourage you to walk into them and ask for it, because that will encourage them to sign it. And have to walk on the internet and find it.
Well, I'm from Bulgaria. I saw you talk about it in Guatemala and you talked about it a bit. Have you worked on any projects, and how do you see the transit in South Shore suburbs kind of evolving?
Well, I don't claim to know your geography well enough.
Okay.
I've done just a little bit of looking at Mumbai. I had a meeting with RCL yesterday with some people. My first impressions are that you are doing the easy thing, which is to identify the rail stations and build towers around them.
Mm-hmm.
The harder thing, but the thing that's more consequential, is to identify the major high quality transit corridors that will be served with buses and encourage appropriate development around them. Because you're not going to be able to ever meet all of your needs, just crowding things around rail stations. And so, when I was touring Lunga yesterday, the thing that struck me was an enormous investment that's clearly been made in the Lunga Yellow Line station. Enormous investments being made around the new REN stations. But then all these arterial corridors where there's a whole lot more land, a whole lot more opportunity. But where you'll have to go in and put in a crosswalk every 400 meters or whatever you want your stop spacing to be. And do those things to make it incrementally more civilized. But ultimately, that's where the great potential is in those suburban areas. I want to do, I came away also with some curiosity about doing some access analysis for Longueuil.
Yeah.
I want to do that because it looks to me like all the planning has been done. I was on the east side of Longueuil, so I was dealing with the yellow line rather than the REM. But the thing that I noticed right away is, oh, there is a big travel time cost to the fact that the yellow line only goes to Berry-UQAM, not to anywhere else in Montreal. You
Yeah.
transfer and you transfer again. And I began trying to plot like a trip from somewhere in eastern Longueuil to the airport. And, oh, okay, so I get to Longueuil station. So even when the REM is finished to the airport, I'm actually going to want a bus from Longueuil station down to Panama station to get on the REM. I'm not going to want to go through the yellow line and the orange line. That's the sort of thing where access analysis pops that out really quickly. And because it may be that what you have there is, in the old fashioned ideology, it's a rail station, therefore it's wonderful. Well, it's actually a rail station with kind of lousy access for a rail station. Maybe there are, it'll be interesting to see how, for example, as REM is completed, how Panama Station develops as frankly being a place with much better regional access by virtue of the fact that the REM goes to so many more places and the yellow line just goes to 2 stations. So those are just some thoughts about Longueuil from not knowing much.
Well, you have had the question.
Yeah, so I have a question about access analysis, actually. Like I'm also a former student of offense, so I very much subscribe to using the 45-minute wall threshold and jobs as like a destination indicator. But like, I'm curious when people, because I think there's like a common criticism to doing that approach, which is that like jobs, it's like, oh, we're analyzing access to jobs, it's like we're planning just for people to access employment.
Right.
But like, what would your response be to that criticism? Or like,
So the first picture I show you is access to jobs because we have good data about jobs.
Okay.
Or at least we did. Now, of course, many people are not actually working at the place that their job theoretically is. And so we're a little less sure about that data now that there's so much work we do. So we debate about this because I want very much to not be imposing my own judgment about the relative importance of different destinations. Now, jobs, it's kind of easy because every job is the destination of one person. Every school enrollment is the destination of one person. But when we talk about a hospital, or when we talk about a shopping destination, I don't want to be deciding that it's more valuable that people can go to this grocery store as opposed to that grocery store in my analysis. Well, one of the other tools that we could be using is that what we're playing is the location-based services data that is ultimately records of cell phones moving around. And although that data is marketed heavily to be origin destination data, I am interested in the possibility of just looking at trip attractions, just looking at where cell phones go as an overall count of how often people seem to value that place. It's still a reaction to what people are doing now. It's not as pure a calculation of freedom as I would like to. But you're absolutely right that we can't just talk about jobs when, in fact, commuting is a declining share of overall trip making. And we need to talk about networks being more broadly used. Absolutely.
Okay, I'll ask a couple of questions from online.
Okay.
So we'll go to Brazil. He's now, I'm not sure if he's in Brazil or in Toronto today, but Rafa Pereira, who's known for his research in accessibility, is asking, he would love to hear from you what you think are the top 2 or 3 biggest barriers for practitioners to incorporate access planning in the local transportation that you have been seeing as when you work with different agencies, how challenging it is, what is the major challenge to get accessibility really in Main Street? Like in your case, it's Main Street, but for others, when you go and talk to them,
It's not mainstream. I don't think it's mainstream even in my work. I think we use it more than any of our competitors. I think that we are all embedded in systems that are ultimately built on what I would call the fantasy of prediction. And the belief that we can, in fact, predict human behavior 10 or 20 years into the future. And traffic engineering is built on that. And it is difficult, I admit, it is difficult to know how to do infrastructure planning, how to make investments when you don't know the future. My only response to that is the whole reason that the act of investment is heroic is that you don't know the future, is that you are taking a risk. And it is the same thing. So I think this is going to, but I mean, I think meant to some extent, we're simply up against the fact that this is a methodology that's challenging the fundamentals of many people's training. It's challenging, it's essentially I'm going up to very senior people and I'm saying something that fundamentally seems to devalue their expertise. I expect them to be resistant to that. I expect a lot of denial, I expect a lot of pushback. And I think it's also something that will probably, that there'll be a sort of generational process of moving beyond that.
I'll ask another one online. Is on-demand a viable solution in your eyes to addressing the accessibility challenges in poor road network planning?
On-demand service is one of several tools for providing low ridership coverage service where ridership is not the objective. So when you have land use patterns that are extremely unsuited to efficient transit, sometimes you encounter situations where the land use pattern is so hostile to any sort of fixed transit that demand responsive is the least inefficient way to serve. On-demand service must never be misunderstood as a way out of the ridership coverage trade-off. It is a kind of coverage service. It also has a very high cost per rider, a very low ridership over cost. Has to always be understood in those terms.
Okay, there are two questions, one from Alberta and one from Vancouver. Let's do them after a couple from in here.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I'm very interested in your opinion about abandoning bus schedules. In my home city of Berlin, they're currently talking about abandoning bus schedules and just defining the headway that's between buses. And I was just wondering what's your opinion?
Oh, it's fine. That's fine. Once you're down to below about 10 minutes. Yeah, that's fine, and that's better. And by and large, so there's a methodology out there that is very widely used, I think already pretty widely used in Europe, where when you get up to a particular kind of single digit frequency, the operational, the way the operation is managed is no longer about delivering a bus at 7:34 because that's what the schedule is. It's about putting the bus out at the beginning of the line at a regular interval and maintaining the interval. Absolutely. I'm all for that. And once you're at a frequency of about 10 minutes or below, buildings react to the scale.
Yeah, I really like his lots and thank you. I just wanted to ask, there's a lot of discourse, especially in North America, about how our cities are built for cars. So we should be more thinking about transitioning to electrifying cars and maybe leapfrogging and not even doing the whole like rail and transit that Europe has. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that. And
Look, that's a lively debate in suburban areas. And obviously, the suburban debate will always appear to present itself as a national debate because the suburbs will always be the majority of the nation living in suburbs. There will be a tendency for that suburban experience to be normalized. I think the important thing to say is that there is also an urban experience. Some of you all, for some reason, chose to come to McGill and to be in the middle of a big city instead of to be in some, if you call it suburban or farm-like or rural kind of campus. where there would be room for all of your cars, but there would be a whole lot less nearby to give richness to your lives. And so there's a reason people live in dense cities, there's a reason people want to live in dense cities. There's a reason why when we build density, even in sort of new urban places, like around the Yellow Line station in Longueuil, they wouldn't be building it if there weren't a market for it. So there is a demand for that. And I think that has to be presented in a way that doesn't sort of threaten the person who really wants to live on their cul-de-sac and drive it. But recognizing that they can have that life. There will be enough of that to people who want it. But that the market is telling us people also want something else. I think the key thing then is to just constantly remind people that, you know, certain answers to this question make sense in certain contexts based on where people live and how they're negotiating life, and to just remind people not to generalize from their own experience.
Okay, all right.
I wanted to say thank you for your comments about on-demand, because I've worked for an on-demand company.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people in my field who are drinking the Kool-Aid of that this is some sort of a microtransit or on-demand transit is some sort of magic bullet. And it's really, as you said, a coverage service. I think that my question is, given that a lot of your expertise is around this access question, and you talked about headways as being one of the sort of metrics of how you measure that. Given that on-demand is variable schedules, it's not always there, how do you measure the kind of access that a coverage service like on-demand would have on a zone that you would apply it on?
Yeah, we have a methodology that we use for creating sort of the equivalent effect. And in my mind, I think it tends to somewhat overstate the real access value of on-demand transit. But what we do is basically inside an on-demand zone, we create a zillion little dummy fixed routes that all run at the frequency of the response time of the on-demand service, since that's essentially equivalent to a frequency. And it gives us more or less the effect that we want of, it correctly models the waiting time, it correctly models the demand responsiveness. What it does not model is trip denials because you've run out of capacity,
Right.
which is very frequently what goes wrong in on-demand services.
Interesting, thank you.
Okay, can I go? I'll go for a couple of online. So Lindsay from Calgary, I think. Can you give an example of how to Alberta, how to hold people responsible for location decisions, especially on one where it's a city council or set politicians on a shorter term election cycle?
Look, I put that at the end of my presentation because it's obviously something that you just always have to have in mind. And and for a lot of your careers, if you go on some sort of planning field, you're going to be at the table talking about something where that decision has already been made, and you have to make the best of it. But what is important is that you never internalize that constraint, is that you always be asking or always be aware that someone decided to put this here. It is not a fact of nature that this Amazon fulfillment center is where it is out here on the wrong side of the freeway where we can't get to it, right? Somebody saved money by choosing that location. That was a good financial decision for someone. Whose was that? Whose decision was that? And how could we shift those incentives over time so that their selfish decision lead to a better decision?
So going even more till Vancouver, now we ask, Stephen is asking, you push back on ridership projections in favor of accessibility measures. How can transit services planners project headways, service hours, number of vehicles required in the absence of projections?
Capacity is one thing where we have to have some way of anticipating, we have to have some way of anticipating loads. The access analysis does not present itself as a solution to capacity planning problems. I'm not surprised that question is coming from Vancouver, where there are places, even in places that are analogous to Longueuil, where they run a bus every 5 or 7 minutes and still have capacity problems because they've just achieved such incredible levels of transit orientation there. So yes, I think that an agency like TransLink has to have set aside a certain amount of resource just to respond to capacity problems as they arise. And an agency that is experiencing constant issues of capacity simply has to set aside more contingencies so that they're able to respond to them in real time. And then obviously keep monitoring them and reallocating appropriate. Obviously, once there's a pandemic or something like that, you can reallocate differently.
Okay, we'll take 2 questions from inside and then we'll wrap it up because I know you must be tired. Because he was giving the talk right before us, actually. So I want him to rest, so.
Hi, Mr. Walker. I'm so glad to hear you in person. I've been following your work for a very long time. I was wondering what would be your thoughts about our, I feel, recent obsession locally in the greater Montreal to consider the elderly as the most vulnerable group of people around our region. English that is not good. I think our elected officials consider people age 64 as having a job, being able to walk everywhere, having a car, being rich, but as soon as you reach 65, then you are vulnerable, you don't have money, you don't have a job, and you cannot walk 100 meters. So do you have some thoughts about this particular movement that we're seeing?
I love elderly people. I want to meet the needs of elderly people. I'm almost an elderly person myself. And another important thing happens when you turn 65, or another important thing happens when you retire, which is that you suddenly have time in your day that you can choose to spend calling your city councilor. So, no, really. And so public feedback, especially public meetings, which require so much time to attend. You just look at the demographics who shows up to these meetings, and they just do not look like the ridership at all. And so I want to meet the needs of older people. I also want them to make good decisions whose consequences they understand about, for example, their location choices later in life. If you raised your family on a cul-de-sac at the far end of Longueuil and you plan to spend the rest of your life on that cul-de-sac, that's fine, but you're not going to get the kind of services that you can expect if you choose to retire in a town in the city. So you still get to make location choices and you still get to own the consequences of those choices. I also think it's important to recognize that as people live longer, they are being healthier longer. And it is no longer appropriate to assume that everyone over 65 can't walk more than, can't walk very far and so on. We have to be responsive to the differences of people's abilities, and that also means, recognizing that people who can walk, often will if we give them something worth walking to. So those are all considerations. Yeah.
Last question. No. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I come from a background of environment and a lot of and I was just curious to know because you talked about the situation in Quebec where the government is trying to make transit more efficient, but that usually means reducing the budget that they give to the STM or to the AOTM. I was just curious to know, do you think it's possible for us as young people to reach either our elected officials or transit agencies and to actually change something about the situation of transit in Quebec? And so how do you think we can reach those messages?
Well, there's a provincial level debate about funding. And unfortunately, a lot of the funding for transit seems to flow through the province. And as a result, that's a debate that happens in the provincial parliament, and that's a matter of influencing and working with your members there. I think that part of that conversation is recognizing how much of the revenue that the province is ultimately working with comes from the urban region. And that the urban region has distinctive needs that are different fundamentally from what rural areas need. Rural areas need far more roads per capita. cities need far more public transit per capita. And there are ways to sort of smooth out that endless urban-rural tension. And make it less of a culture war by simply emphasizing. I think that, I think that's the key reality. Once you're inside the city, working with your municipal, leaders. There, I think it's fundamentally about, because these leaders are hearing all the time from people who are concerned about parking and concerned that they can't drive everywhere. And I think it's fundamental, I think they need the education about what a city is. And that a city is lots of people living closer together, which means a city is a shortage of space per person, which means a city is the need to use space efficiently, which cars don't do. And that's what a city is. And to just keep coming back to that. And to recognize too, that this seems to be what people want. Because we wouldn't be building all these towers in one grade. People didn't want to live there.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
There are all the ways to find me. So please stay in touch.
Thank you so much, everyone online, and you can join us in other sessions. Goodbye.
Thank you.